South Korea's East Asian neighbors, China and Japan, are engaged in a conflict over comments by the latter's prime minister regarding Taiwan. With more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Friday, November 28th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Confrontation continues between Beijing and Tokyo over a remark made by Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi during a session at the House of Representatives Budget Committee on November 7th. For more on this, I have Anthony Kuhn, a correspondent for American public broadcaster NPR here in the studio. Anthony, so good to have you with us today.
Thanks. Nice to be back.
I also have Professor Kim Jae-chun, Dean of the Graduate School of International Studies at Sogang University, live on the line. Professor Kim, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's good to be with you. Thank you.
Right, Anthony, for the sake of our viewers who may not have been following the feud between Beijing and Tokyo, could you begin by walking us through the start of the latest tensions between these two countries?
Yes, the dispute started on November 7th. When Prime Minister Takaichi was taking questions from lawmakers in Parliament. And the subject was the possibility of a so-called Taiwan contingency, a conflict between China in Taiwan. And the questions had to do with what could cause an existential threat, which would meet the legal requirements for Japan to mobilize its military. And for the most part, Prime Minister Takaichi stuck to what the government's line is, which is they will have to see. All sorts of things could happen, and Japan has a very restrictive constitution and security laws to be met on this. So for the most part, she said, we'll see. But then she started going into scenarios which no previous prime minister had, at least not in office. And one of the scenarios she talked about was a possible naval blockade by China of Taiwan that could constitute an existential threat and justify the mobilization of Japan's self-defense forces. Now, the closest thing to this was in 2021 when former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said a Taiwan contingency would also be a Japan contingency, but he didn't go into specific scenarios and he wasn't in office anymore. Now, the context is really important. The opposition politicians asking the questions were trying to nail her down because what constitutes an existential threat is very vague. So they don't want Japan blundering into any conflict. But being specific about this can endanger the strategic ambiguity that Japan and the U.S. have had for many, many years. China called this, a brazen act of interference in its internal affairs because it sees Taiwan as part of its own territory, and that's how the dispute got started.
All right. In the meantime, Professor Kim, the term wolf warrior diplomacy has been making headlines amid the dispute between these two East Asian neighbors. First, what exactly does this diplomacy, if you will, entail, and what have been some of the consequences of this diplomacy, Professor Kim?
Wolf warrior diplomacy refers to a very confrontational Chinese diplomacy, which I think is based on naked Chinese nationalism. And this line of diplomacy came into play in the late 2010s. And it involves not just Chinese diplomats, but also the mass public aggressively defending Chinese interests, often by confronting neighboring countries with sharp rhetoric, and more importantly, with economic coercion. One example that comes to my mind is China's retaliation against South Korea over the South Korea's decision to deploy THAAD, which is the abbreviation of Terminal High Altitude Defense, and also to Australians. China retaliated by cutting back on Australian wine and iron ore imports. I think the consequences of wolf warrior diplomacy are a mixed bag at best. In the short run, China was able to pressure neighboring countries into being more accommodating to its interests, but in the long run, it has strained relations not only with South Korea, but also with Australia, Japan, and with many other countries. So in the end, it gave rise to a more negative global perception of China. But this time, as Anthony just mentioned, it seems as though Japan is the one that is on the defensive side for a number of reasons.
Right. Anthony, as you said, China has used very harsh rhetoric to condemn the remarks by Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi. What have been some of the actions that Japan has taken in response to these remarks?
Well,
that China has taken.
Yeah, I think you could call it a big-scale campaign. You could call it a sort of a full-court press. The goals are quite clear. They want Takaichi to take back her remarks, which is, politically not feasible domestically for her. And they want Japan to stay away from this red line that they see the Taiwan issue as being. And, they've used both diplomatic pressure, including letters to the UN, and also economic, some people would say coercion, some people would say statecraft. They've suspended once again the import of Japanese seafood. They've told Japanese visitors not to go to Japan because of public safety, because of crime, which Japan has refuted. They've cut back on flights from China to Japan. They've suspended youth exchanges and movies and a lot of things. It could cost China billions of dollars altogether. I couldn't hear Professor Kim hear him too well, but this does fit a pattern of retribution against countries, which has not been resolved until a new administration comes in. It's happened not only in South Korea, but also in Australia, also in the Philippines. But Takaichi just took office. She's got extremely high poll ratings. So to think that this dispute could continue on, past her administration is certainly very concerning. Now, China has many reasons why it might want to climb down to de-escalate this feud for its own economy, so as not to drive Japan further into the U.S. camp. But Taiwan, it says it's a red line, and it really is a higher priority than any of these other issues.
Right, for China, of course. Professor Kim, a trilateral culture ministers meeting among South Korea, Japan, and China that was initially scheduled to take place this past Monday over in Macau was cancelled in light of the ongoing conflict between Beijing and Tokyo. Do you suppose trilateral cooperation on all fronts will see a halt? And if that is the case, how does South Korea seek to navigate these latest regional tensions?
Well, unfortunately, it's not just the bilateral relations between China and Japan that are being adversely affected here. The trilateral relationship between South Korea, China, and Japan is also taking a hit. And if my memory serves me correct, wasn't only the culture ministers meeting that got just canceled. China has refused to participate in the trilateral summit between the three countries that Japan had been preparing for early next year. This issue has just blown up. And right now, Beijing has no intention to scale down the tension here. And as a matter of fact, this bilateral dispute has gotten expanded into bigger regional and international problem. China is even trying to take this issue to the United Nations and international courts. So for now, trilateral cooperation is bound to take a hit. Honestly, we just have to wait until the tension reaches its peak and then starts to ease off. For South Korea, I think it's important not to take sides with either China or Japan. Frankly, we can't really play the role of mediator here. And even the United States isn't stepping in to mediate. So what Seoul can do is to stick to the most basic principle, and that is peace between the two neighbors matters, and then the conflict needs to be resolved quickly through diplomatic means. That's the kind of basic, principled messages that we should keep emphasizing.
Right, and speaking about the U.S., Anthony, Donald Trump sought to speak on the phone separately to his Chinese and Japanese counterparts after the start of this diplomatic feud between these two countries. What do you suppose would be the broader implications of bitter ties between Beijing and Tokyo for Washington?
Yes, well, the timing was really interesting. He spoke with Chinese leaders, President Trump spoke with Chinese leader Xi Jinping by phone. Trump did not mention that they spoke about Taiwan, but China says that they did. Right after that call, Trump called Takaichi. And Trump, in his social media post about this, did not mention that they spoke about the Japan-China dispute. But some media, I believe Reuters, has reported that Trump told Takaichi, please don't add fuel to the fire, do not, don't make things any worse than they were. So what was Trump trying to do there? Was he trying to mediate between the two? Or was he, having just spoken to Xi Jinping, trying to tamp down Takaichi? Now, I think we can say that China is feeling pretty confident following its meeting with Xi Jinping, the meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump in Busan. They feel like they've successfully fended off the trade pressures, reached a deal. And they seem to feel like they have Trump's number. And that is also a concern for Japan, because they fear that Trump could cut some sort of a deal with Xi Jinping and China that leaves them out. But because Trump didn't say exactly what he said with Takaichi, it's still very hard to say. But I think China and the U.S. see each other as the main rivals in this. And so, for example, President Biden, former President Biden, also made remarks that seemed to veer away from strategic ambiguity, but it passed. Now we're in a very different ballgame, and so Japan has a lot of reason for concern that its interests may be bypassed or ignored in the rivalry between U.S. and China.
Right. Taiwan, meanwhile, Professor Kim, has reportedly requested for membership into AUKUS. For the sake of our general audience, could you tell us a bit about the AUKUS security framework? And second, what are your thoughts regarding Taiwan's request, Professor Kim?
Well, AUKUS is basically a defense partnership among the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. But one thing that we'll have to note is that it's not a traditional alliance, but more of a framework for defense technology cooperation. And one notable example is the U.S. sharing nuclear-powered submarine technology with Australians. On top of that, three countries are working together on advanced defense technologies, things like cyber, AI, quantum, and even undersea cable projects that strengthen digital and military resilience. The whole idea is pretty much, aimed at countering China's growing influence in the Indo-Pacific region. So, from Taiwan's perspective, it makes perfect sense for them to be part of something like AUKUS, because standing alone against China is very tough, So joining AUKUS would seem to make, Taiwan's deterrence easier. Of course, Beijing is going to be furious. Beijing is going to push back really hard against any such move. But one thing we need to keep in mind, though, is that, as I said before, AUKUS is not a mutual defense alliance. If China were to launch a military attack on Taiwan, AUKUS is not obliged to send troops. These three countries in AUKUS are not obliged to send troops or intervene directly. So membership, itself, in and of itself, wouldn't guarantee Taiwan's defense. At best, it would give Taiwan, access to more advanced technologies and closer cooperation with three Western countries. But it's not going to provide the security, guarantee, the kind of security guarantee you will get from a former, mutual treaty alliance.
Right, so it might be more symbolic for Taiwan then. And while Taiwan reaches out to the Trilateral Security Framework, Anthony, China, as you mentioned, has been calling on multilateral platforms to take action against Japan by claiming that Japan's remarks on Taiwan is a violation of international law and a challenge to post-war order. What are your takeaways?
Well, actually, their letter to the UN was fairly narrow. The most important charge in that is they said that Japan is threatening the use of force against China. And Japan rebutted that. But, you know, this year has been quite special with the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II and the beginning of the second Trump administration, which has seen a pullback from many multilateral platforms, including the UN. And so China has used this to craft a narrative. We saw on September 3rd this military parade in which China emphasized its contribution to building the post-war order by defeating Japan, by helping being an early member of the UN. But there are many holes in that. It was the Nationalist Party which ruled China at the time. They had a big hand in defeating Japan. They were the ones who were in the UN, who were the first members of the first Chinese government in the UN. Now, you know, since Japan has been beefing up its military in recent years, China has tried to portray this as a potential return of Japanese militarism. Japan is certainly not the way it was in the 1930s. It's a stable democracy. It hasn't fought any wars. That isn't to say that some people in Japan are not concerned about Japan's direction. There is still a problem. There are people within the ruling party who continue to deny some of Japan's actions in World War II, and there are some people who don't like the way the U.S. imposed a constitution on Japan. But the market, I would say, as we saw in the September 3rd parade, the market for China's narrative of itself as defender of the international order has been fairly limited to so-called like-minded countries, including Russia, North Korea, Iran, and not the Western nations.
Right. I wonder, Professor Kim, speaking within your capacity as a scholar, do you believe the world right now, perhaps, is more prone to conflict than it was in the past? And if so, why?
Sure, I would probably say that the world is definitely more conflict prone today than, say, some 20 years ago. First of all, the US-centered unipolar international order has basically broken down. And along with that, so-called rules-based liberal international order, you know, RBIO, that order is being increasingly challenged. A clear example is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You know, after the Cold War was over, most people thought that the kind of, outright aggression that Russia launched against Ukraine, you know, this kind of aggression was not going to happen again. You know, one sovereign state using military force to invade another sovereign state. You know, that was pretty unthinkable. And I believe that principle, you know, keeping other sovereign states, you know, sovereignty intact was the most important, you know, that was at the core of liberal international order, rules-based liberal international order. But Russia has openly defied that. Now, you know, we oftentimes talk about the return of great, you know, power strategy competition, return of great power politics. And historically, that kind of great power strategic rivalry tends to lead to what I would call blockization of order, blockization of the international order. And you can see this very clearly in Northeast Asian region, where the United States, South Korea, and Japan are lining up together on one side, while North Korea, China, and Russia are forming up, you know, forming another bloc, camp, if you will. So with this blockization, what I would call blockization, North Korea's strategic value has gone up for Beijing and Moscow, and Pyongyang knows it very well. So Pyongyang is trying to position itself as a defender of interests of China and Russia. And that, I think, is the reason why China and Russia now have very little interest in North Korea's denuclearization anymore, because North Korea's strategic values loom larger than before. So, early 2000s, we saw some sort of cooperative mechanism in Northeast Asian region, something like a six-party talks. But that is, that sort of consensus that existed back in, 2000, I don't think it's going to happen anymore.
Right, rendering quite dismal the prospects of denuclearization here on the Korean Peninsula in the near future then. All right, Professor Kim, I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today.
Thank you.
Anthony, thank you very much for your insights.
You're welcome.
Right, on that note, we end this week's editions of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. Have a great weekend.